She liked immensely to hear all about them. They sometimes served for her amusement, but it was her own nonsense that gave zest to the gossip. She never turned them into ridicule. She was as far as possible from being either censorious or satirical. She never abused them or quizzed them. That was the word of the day, an ugly word now obsolete, and the ugly practice which it bespoke is far less prevalent now under any name than it was then. The laugh she occasionally raised was by for imagining for her neighbours impossible contingencies, by relating in prose or verse some trifling incident coloured to her own fancy, or in writing a history of what they had said or done that could deceive nobody. As an instance, I would give her description of the pursuits of Miss Mills and Miss Yates, two young ladies of whom she knew next to nothing. They were only on a visit to a near neighbour, but their names tempted her into rhyme, and so on she went. This was before my time. Mrs. Lefroy knows the lines better than I do. I believe she has a copy, and I shall not attempt to quote them imperfectly here. To about the same date perhaps may be referred, at least it was equally before my time, a few chapters which I overheard of a mock heroic story written between herself and one of her nieces, and I doubt not at her instigation. If I remember rightly, it had no other foundation than their having seen a neighbour passing on the coach without having previously known that he was going to leave home. This, I have since been told, was written entirely by the niece, only under her encouragement. I did not often see my aunt with a book in her hand, but I believe she was fond of reading, and that she had read and did read a good deal. I doubt whether she cared very much for poetry in general, but she was a great admirer of Crabbe, and consequently took a keen interest in finding out who he was. Other contemporary writers were well known, but his origin having been obscure, his name did not announce itself. However, by diligent inquiry, she was ere long able to inform the rest of the family that he held the living of Trowbridge, and had recently married a second time. A very warm admirer of my aunt's writing, but a stranger in England, lately made the observation that it would be most interesting to know what had been Miss Austen's opinions on the great public events of her time, a period, as she rightly observed, of the greatest interest, for my aunt must have been a young woman able to think at a time of the French Revolution, and the long disastrous chapter then begun was closed by the Battle of Waterloo 2 years before her death. Anyone might naturally desire to know what part such a mind as hers had taken in the great strifes of war and policy, which so disquieted Europe for more than 20 years. And yet it was a question that had never before presented itself to me, and though I have now retraced my steps on this track, I have found absolutely nothing. The general politics of the family were Tory, rather taken for granted, I suppose, than discussed, as even my uncles scarcely ever talked about it. And in vain do I try to recall any word or expression of Aunt Jane's that had any reference to public events. Some bias, of course, she must have had, but I can only guess to which quarter it inclined. Of her historical opinions, I am able to record thus much: that she was a most loyal adherent of Charles I, and that she always encouraged my youthful belief in Mary Stuart's perfect innocence of all the crimes with which history has charged her memory. My aunt must have spent much time in writing. Her desk lived in the drawing-room. I often saw her writing letters on it, and I believe she wrote much of her novels in the same way, sitting with her family when they were quite alone, but I never saw any manuscript of that sort in progress. She wrote very fully to her brothers when they were at sea, and she corresponded with many others of her family. There is nothing in those letters which I have seen that would be acceptable to the public. They were very well expressed, and they must have been very interesting to those who received them, but they detailed chiefly home and family events, and she seldom committed herself even to an opinion, so that to strangers there could be no transcript of her mind. They would not feel that they knew her any better for having read them. They were rather overcautious. For excellence, her letters to Aunt Cassandra, for they were sometimes separated, were, I dare say, open and confidential. My aunt looked them over and burnt the greater part, as she told me, 2 or 3 years before her own death. She left, or gave, some as legacies to the nieces, but of those that I have seen, several had portions cut out. Aunt Jane was so good as frequently to write to me, and in addressing a child, she was perfect.